Sharon. Okay, so I guess the main thing. So this is like the Squawk like Flask Models Lab with the Foursquare data. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I think a lot of you are still working on it or maybe haven't gotten to it yet. That's fine, but I just wanted to like hopefully clear some stuff up about using the models and things like that. Let's open up the code base. So the way this works, you can see this, right? We have this, I guess we have this migrations file, and here I can just get a sense. This is one way to get a sense of the structure of your tables, is just to look, at them. So here we have these venues and locations. I don't know, we just have venues and categories. It's kind of interesting. And then we have the c.py. Is it familiar? This seems different than what you all dealt with. I know, Flask Models Lab. This is the same thing, right? Yeah, okay. I guess we will use this then. So let's look at this. All right. So you can kind of see what's happening. The first thing I'd probably do is just get a sense of the tables. So if I look at create tables, one very obvious thing, I notice there's more than one table this time. We have this venue. And then I'd probably think about like the relationship between tables if there is one. So here I actually do not see any foreign keys. Okay, so it seems like perhaps we just have these two different tables. So thus far, there is no connection between them. That will probably change in the future, but so far there's not. The other thing maybe we can look at is, I think, is this c.py file. So this is kind of interesting. I'm not sure, I don't think we've shown how to do this, but this is initializing some data here, right? Like you kind of see it, right? Then creating some sample data for our development database. All right. I don't think we showed, like I said, I don't think we showed how to do this yet, but we will be building up to this in future lessons. All right. So we'll just start with this create tables thing. And our whole goal at this point is we'll just create some initial tables. Do we have any tests here? So we do have some tests. This seems to create a venue instance. That's kind of interesting. How are you guys able to successfully do this? And then I have this right here. Wait, is this did I do all this for you? I did all this for you? Yes or no? I'm sorry. I don't know. Anyway, I'll explain. I guess I'll explain what kind of how something like this. I think this is too far advanced. Let me go to the Flask models reading. I think that might be too hard, like based on what you have learned. What about that? Okay, so we have this database, and let's kind of just talk through this. For now. So here we have this NHL.db, and this is kind of the main thing we need. So if we have this NHL.db, then we can build maybe an application around it. All right, let me just even move this. Make directory, we'll call this lecture app, and then we'll maybe move the NHL.db into the lecture app. And let's go from there. All right, and now let's just create a new file. I think we'll call it, we'll just create a console.py, and then maybe we'll create one more thing called a player.py. All right, and let's start up. Okay. So we want to connect to this database. So say import SQLite3, and then we'll do SQLite3.connect, and then we'll do NHL.db, and this will be connection to my database, and then we'll do connection.cursor, and this will be my cursor object. And then I just want to honestly just see this thing for now. Cursor.execute, select all from players. And then let's just run this file, python3-i console.py. So what we've done is we've selected all from players. And now if I want to view this thing, I'll do cursor.fetch all. And here's my players. All right. So now this kind of, let me close some of this. This kind of data structure is annoying to work with. Like it's just a list of tuples, right? But you can see what the data starts to look like is that we have, what I'm guessing is, right, like the ID, the name, the number, right, the thing on the back of the sweater, the height, weight, handedness, or whatever, hometown. I guess maybe this is his age. And birthday. And then finally his number. Okay? So what we want to do, and this is kind of the point, is like what we're doing is for us as developers, trying to make it easier so that we can link this tuple to these attributes. And what would be even nicer, like, there's an easy way to do this, but what would be even nicer perhaps is if we created like a player class. If you have a class called player, and then you have like a couple functions, right, like his age or whatever, it would be nice if, when we just create a new player, it's a blank object. Like it doesn't really have any data in it. But we can perhaps make it easy so that we can pass through this data and it will immediately kind of like set up all these attributes. That's the idea. All right. So let's just see this. Let's start by, let's do select all from players where ID equals, and I want to put a 0 in here, but I know I shouldn't. So if I want to get the first player, what I should do is put a question mark and then this comma or the ID comma, right? And we could set the ID equal to 1. Okay. Why do we have to do this ID comma thing? Well, remember, we don't want to allow for SQL injection, right? So we move any values that would typically come from the user and move it out into the second argument. Here, because you can have multiple question marks, imagine if you have and name equals, name, right? Well, this again would be coming from the user. So I'd want to move this over here. And now I would put another question mark. Okay, and maybe you'd have name equals Connor. So the interface, so basically the point is that when you're passing through this data, this method takes a string followed by a tuple. And if that tuple only has one value, you still need a comma. Because in Python, if you just put parentheses and put like a single value, it evaluates that as the number 1. Okay? This is the number 1. This is not. This is a tuple. Okay? So you need that comma afterwards. Okay, so kind of back to our story, which is we would like to take this set of values and then create an instance with it. Okay? So how will we do that? So one way we've done that in the past is we've simply kind of, we can like pass through, like kind of set it up like this, where we have like the ID and put these each as different arguments and do something like that, right? Now let's think about this. If I want to pass through each of these arguments, let's take a look. We'll call these my player values. Okay, and I'm just going to put a breakpoint here. And now let's import my player. From player, import player. All right, this is pretty good. So we have access to my player class. We're going to get these player values. Let's see this thing. Oh, I messed this up. I didn't update this. This is saying incorrect number of binding supplies. The current statement uses 2, and there are 1 supplied. So it's saying, hey, there's 2 question marks. You're only passing through 1 value, right? And that's because I didn't update this. All right, so now if I look at player values, this is a single player's values, right? And I want to pass this through my player class. Now, if you kind of remember, I can do this, I believe. If I pass through, put the star here, what's that going to do? It's going to treat each one of these things as a separate argument, right? If you don't put the star, it treats this whole, how many arguments are provided? Just 1, right? 1 giant tuple is passed through the player class. And so we're going to get an error that says, hey, we're asking for like 8 different arguments or something here, and you're only passing through 1 large list. See this? Missing 8 required positional arguments. Why? Because we don't have the star here. We're just passing through 1 list. However, if we do pass through the star, now all of a sudden we are in our breakpoint, right? So we are, it's almost as if we're doing player 1, comma, Sean Couturier, comma, 27, comma, right? We're separating these out into different arguments. And now if you look over here, you can see that like here's the ID, here's the name, here's the age. All right, so this is one way to kind of like pass through different arguments, and you could do like self.id equals ID, self.name equals name, self.age, right, equals the age, etc. Right? Because do you guys follow this? That we are, the procedure that I just did that works is to do player star initialize a player class and like splat, meaning like take this thing and separate it out into different arguments. Does that follow, you all follow that or no? Yeah? Okay. That's one way to do it. And then, but the kind of the downside of it, I guess, is that we have to write these things out individually. There is another way that we can do this. The other way is we can say, okay, these are my columns. And I think I just call them columns. And let's put, turn these into a quotation mark. All right. Okay, so now let's look at this code again. So this time, we're going to get our player values. Let's just run it. So we have these player values. Again, we're starting with this list because we are selecting all from players where the ID equals 1, right? And now we want to, again, create a new instance. This time, oh, I'm messing one thing up. We're just going to pass through values. So instead of separating out these things, we're just going to do player and then pass through all the values at once. Let me just exit out and quickly rerun this. Player values. This time we're just going to pass through this list of values. So we'll do player and pass through all the values, all the player values. And that will, create a new object. What we still are going to need to do is kind of somehow assign them to each one of these corresponding values. So let's see how we can do that. So I'll put a breakpoint here. We'll rerun this. We'll create with my player values. So player values, again, is these tuples. And now I'm just going to create an instance. It's going to get passed through here. And so the values will be the data, and the columns will be like the keys. Kind of follow that? So we hit our breakpoint. At this point, we can look at values. Values is the data. Why? because we passed through, we just did this, player values, or player like this. And this is this tuple right here. So this guy is this, and then when I look over here, it gets passed through as the values. And now we also have the keys. The keys are what self.columns, right? So I can kind of easily create a new player instance if, say, I was to zip together the self.columns and the values and maybe convert it to a dictionary. You see that? And then what I can do is I can take this current instance self, right, the player object, because I'm right in here, and do self.dunderdict and like kind of set all the attributes equal to this dictionary. Self.dunderdict equals this dictionary where I'm zipping together the columns and the values, where the values are getting passed through from the console, right, or from wherever I'm initializing it. So now if you look at, now like things are pretty nice because I can call it self.id is 1, self.name is Sean Couturier, right? Everything lined up because of this part right here. Okay. So that's what we're doing. We're just making things a little bit easier by doing self.dunderdict equals the zipping together of the keys, right, these columns that we're defining up top, and the values. And then maybe let's convert it to a dictionary. And now, when we run this, my player instance should be like good. Right? How did that work? We have these player values, Sean Couturier, right? These numbers. We know how this data is coming back. So we're going to set up our columns to line up to how the data is coming back. And then we are going to just pair up the values with these columns. So these values with these columns turn into a dictionary, zip it together, turn it into a dictionary, assign it to this dunderdict thing on an instance. And that like perfectly gives me this instance. And if I look at player.dunderdict, right, we're good. Okay, so this is what we're doing of like taking this data, this list of values that comes back like this, and turning it into an instance. We're doing this for us, the developer, right? Like this makes my life easier. If now I get to work, like I like working with instances because eventually we'll have methods on it, or just doing .id and like getting stuff like that. It makes it easier to work with this data, and it doesn't cost, like from a time complexity perspective, it doesn't cost us really anything. We can put validation, like getters and setters, and remember like validation on this to turn this into an integer or whatever, right? Like turn this into an integer, do like a calculation based off of it. All that stuff we can really start to use. So that's kind of the first thing, I guess, to go through. Questions about that? Go ahead.
On your other one, console.py.
Mm-hmm.
I'm passing the instance directly, not a like a player values equal to cursor.fetch one, right? And still it's working automatically doing behind the scene.
Oh,
so I'm passing, like for example, I'm passing if you store some value cursor.execute in a variable, the top, number 7 line. If you store this whole value in a variable, say x equal to this one.
Yeah.
And then I'm not fetching anything. And then I'm assigning the class for of this one, and it's working fine with me. So
you're doing
I don't know
like
how.
this?
Yeah.
We can try it. I don't know. I've never done this. We can try it. So kind of the question is, do we need to do fetch at all? Maybe not. Let's see. Okay, that was a little weird. right? Because now I have this ID. So it is. I don't understand what's happening. It's setting the ID. I get what's happening. I don't get why. It's just setting the ID equal to this. This is the tuple, and then we're passing it through. It should be coming through as values here. We can just put a breakpoint here. Let's see. And I'm just gonna. I always have a habit of. All right. Well, so we'll put the. Let's take a look up. Let's see what values is. Oh, look at that. It's the cursor object, and I think when maybe. I don't know if somehow when you zip it together, it then calls fetch one. I don't know. So it's passing the cursor object. I don't totally get it. I don't think but it's not great. And maybe it works for you, Pally, but I'm not able to reproduce it that easily. So I would probably just stick with calling fetch one. Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into it. All right, so this is what we're doing, right? We kind of can select the player, get a player from the database, and then quickly turn it into an instance. Now the idea with your Flask application is, let's do app.py, right? And they'll say from Flask, import Flask, and then we'll do create a new Flask app, set this name thing, set it equal to app, and then let's do app.route. Let's do players / players. Actually, we'll do /player / ID. Def show player. Pass through the ID. And then what do we want to do? Okay. So the task is, let's put an app.run here. So the idea is this, like when a user goes to, let's run this thing. All right, so we'll go to localhost. There is no route for /, right? There is no root path, so this makes sense. But the idea is, I'm going to need to do this, right, to make this dynamic. So the idea is, when the user goes to /player /1, what do we want to have? What do we want to occur? Okay, well the first thing is get the data. Okay, so we'll say. We'll copy over our SQLite 3 stuff for now. I think I have to do this inside. And we'll connect to the database, right? So we're connecting to our database. And then we'll mimic our old code. Cursor.execute, select all from players where the ID equals $, comma, ID, don't forget this comma. All right, and then we'll do cursor.fetch 1, and this will be my player values. Okay, so at this point, we already have all the data. Like, we could just kind of return this to the user in a way. But as I said, it's nicer if you have the whole instance. So what we'll do is this same procedure of from player, import the player class, then all we need to do, I think, is just pass through the player values, and we have a player instance. And now you get to use like all the methods that you define in your player class. Let's put a breakpoint here. Yeah, I think this is okay. So I'll just refresh. And now let's click on this, and we'll go to /players /1. So where are we? We're in our breakpoint. We are right here. We've connected to our database. We've already selected, right, found this data, and that's your my player values, right? That's the list of tuples. That's just this one tuple, like Connor or whatever. And then we're turning this into an instance, right? Taking this data, turning it into a player instance, and then we can work from there. So let's take a look. It seems like it already, I think it hit, do I have a breakpoint and a init? I have a breakpoint here too. Let's take this out. All right, so I'm here's my breakpoint in show player, line 14. Now let's just take a look at this stuff. So my player values, that is this tuple, right? So it successfully selected the player where the ID equals 1. And where is that coming from? It's coming from the, some user went to visit our website and asked for the player with ID 1. So we got it for him. And now we'll take those player values, initialize an instance with it, right? So we're basically running this line of code. And this line of code, remember, is taking this list, zipping it together with the columns, and then turning that into a dictionary, and then assigning that to be the attributes of an instance. So if you look at the player object, which is defined here, this player.dunderDict has the proper data. And this data is kind of the return value my end user would like to see. So I can just return player.dunderDict if you want. Less times what I prefer to do is JSONify the data, meaning I want to make sure, like, you can't send a Python dictionary through the wires of the internet. You have to send a string. And remember, JSONify will, like, basically turn this into a string. So I'll say from Flask, import Flask, comma, JSONify, and then just JSONify this dictionary. And now, if I refresh here, that works. Okay? So this is, right, like the request response cycle. And we're following a pattern. Like, I know that we don't have a lot of methods in our class. We have basically 0. So it may seem overkill right now, but we will have methods in our class. You'll have to take my word for it. Just like we did with tic-tac-toe and those other things. We're going to have that and then some, right? So this is the process. Get the data from the database first. Then make it easier. Then make the data cleaner by turning it into an instance. And make it pretty easy to create an instance, because we just have to pass through this list of values from the database, and they line up and assign the correct attributes. And now we can then turn this thing into a dictionary, this instance into a dictionary by doing, player.dunderDict, and turn that dictionary into a string. Stringify, essentially, the dictionary. How does that feel? Like, you can express your discomfort or uncertainty with it. No.
Yeah, so it mentioned in the lab model view controller. So the player.py, that is just the model.
Yes, this is our model. One thing I want to point out about a model is very closely related to the corresponding table, right? So these columns, obviously, right, these are the columns in the database, and it's very tied together with your table.
And so the model doesn't have any of the code for querying the database itself. The controller does that.
Good question. It can. It can. Like, for example, you could, for instance, write like a method called find, like a class method. Like, we'd get into it, but maybe you would, just to, like, I'm so tempted, you could do something like this: class method def find self ID, and then write a method here, select all from players where ID equals question mark, and then take the self.id and pass that through, and create an instance that way. So so as long as it's related to this class and this table, yeah, you could write maybe like a find method, and then over here instead of directly writing the SQL right here, you could do player.find, take the ID and pass it through. But we will get we'll get there. But that's why does this make sense? Because remember, our model is closely connected to the database, so then having a method that allows us to find the correct record here, yeah, there's a good argument for it. But we'll move up to that. Either way.
But
Yeah.
if we write a SQL statement in the model, then there will be a controller.
Yeah, so you won't need it here. Instead, you'll have to call this method, and this method will produce the exact same SQL that we put here, right? Because player.find just has the same exact code.
So yeah, that's what I'm saying. Then this will become a model viewer, or there is no controller in between them. Then
Well,
right?
this is still getting run, right? You still need to so the controller. Let's talk about what the controller is about. The controller is very much about taking an input from the browser and sending back a response to the browser. Okay? So that's really if the model is very closely tied to the database, to the corresponding table, the controller is actually very tied to, people will say like the view, but by the view, what I really mean is a request. So you can do import request. I think we've done this before. Is a request or requests? And then you can put a breakpoint here. It knows all about the browser asking for a specific record, and it knows about sending back a response to the browser. That's what the controller's job is. Okay? It's like, you're asking for this. I'm going to use these other tools to then produce it, to then send this back to you. A very good, just to expand upon this concept, right? A very good like kind of analogy. Let me go to the whiteboard. I upgraded my Zoom, so hopefully it's a little better. Tell me if it's not. So, can you see me drawing?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so you go to the browser, right, and you do players/1. And now that goes through the internet, right? Where does it kind of enter into your application is the controller, right? This, whatever we call it, app.py, but this is our controller. And the controller then, says, okay, I want to get to the database record, so it has this /players/ID type of thing, and it's handling the requests right now from the browser, and ultimately it needs to hand back a response. What is the response? The response is the data that we want. So to do that, how does it do that? It's going to go to the model, or really go to like somehow either the database or the model to get there. So here we have this player.py file, and then we'll have it correspond to a players table in the database. So this is kind of like my player.py, and this is closely tied to the database, and especially to a players table. Sorry, I can't write. There's like a players table in here. So now for the analogy, which is like a restaurant essentially. When you the user, right? Like when you, a customer, walk into a restaurant and you order something off the menu, you're kind of going, the controller is kind of like the waiter in the sense that it's handling a request and it's giving back a response, right? You're ordering from, you the customer are asking the waiter for something, right? And then the waiter goes to the back of the house and gives it back to you gives that data, what you're asking for, back, right? So that's kind of the controller's job. It doesn't directly cook the stuff. Sorry if this analogy is falling, but it doesn't exactly cook the stuff, right? It kind of can lean on the model, right, or like the chef to do that. But what it does do is handle the request and hand it back to the user. That's really the controller's job. It's the interface, right, between with the end user interacts with, right? And that's really like the routes, right? Like you ask for data through the route, and then it's like determines what's needed. Cool, I'm gonna have to go get this player, turn into an instance, turn that instance into a dictionary, send that dictionary back to you, because that's what you're asking for. And it may seem like a little, I guess, for the controller to do that, but handling requests and responses is, like you could see, we showed you before everything involved in a request object. There's a lot of stuff there. Like there can be a lot of logic, and we want to keep we want to keep our code simple if we can.
I have something to ask along with this, but so right now we've created the endpoint to spit out like the dictionary, right? Or to give the user back the dictionary. And in the lab, you had us have the endpoint, I think, spit out the view, like the show, like the actual.
You mean the HTML?
HTML. So would you still keep all of this code, but only just return the template, like do the render template?
So okay, if you want to return, so this is kind of what I mean. Like sometimes I don't know how to. In a lot of applications, you may like the JSON and the HTML, they're equivalent. Or a lot of it is equivalent. In both cases, like the user's asking to see information about a single player, and the code is essentially the same, right? The only difference is that instead of returning the JSON, we can return, HTML. So maybe we return, this render template, player/show.html, and now I need to import render template and say, what is this again? Default? Sorry, I can never remember this.
Template folder.
Template folder, thank you. Template folder equals views. And then, just create a views folder. And now create, what do we call it? Player/show. Let's create one more folder. Players. Then we'll create one folder underneath that. Or one file. Show.html. All right. And now I just want to have it show, just make sure this works for now. So this will now render player show.html. Let's refresh this. Did I break this? Player.py self. Hold on. It was breaking here. Oh yeah, because let's comment this out. All right, we'll run this again. And I need to Google doesn't like me anymore. Okay, so this says show player. What do we really want it to say? We want it to pass through the player data. So just player equals player. And now we're passing through this instance right here. And what we can do here is do like player.name, right? Player.age, whatever else we have. And try that. So this is the same thing. Like what code did we change? Only things related to this last line. Everything else is the same. And lots of times you can even configure your website so you can, like what a user can do is sometimes do like .json, and when they put in .json, the JSON is returned, and when they don't, if like the HTML is returned. So the user can, and in both cases, it goes to the same route, and you just have an if-else statement. So like if JSON requested, like put in the JSONify version of the player. Otherwise, put in the HTML version. Right? I forget how to do that in Flask, but the point is, this conceptually and in code, whether you're asking for JSON or HTML, is very, very is essentially the same code. Right? All of this is the same. The idea is get the player and send it back to me as a user in a way I can understand that information. Right? You're asking for the same data. Let's go back to the diagram. So what are kind of takeaways from here? Right? When you think of the model, right, the model is very closely related to the database. When you think of the controller is very closely related to, people say the view, or another way is just like, I think of it as just like very closely related to the request and the response, right? I'm asking for players 1. We catch that in the route. We send back, the controller directly sends back the resulting JSON. how does it get the data? It can, you know, get it essentially from the model layer, right? The model, you know, you could call this, people will call this like the data layer, right? Because it deals with the data. This deals with, the controller deals with handling requests and handing back responses, okay? So you can kind of think, you know, to give the analogy, right? This, we said this could be kind of like my waiter. This could kind of be like my chef is the model, and then maybe the database is like the ingredients, you know? So it's like take the ingredients, take that, you know, that tuple, that kind of the raw data, turn it into an instance, I guess, kind of, and then send it, you know. So this, the waiter asks the chef to, hey, give me this thing, and the chef or the waiter gives it back to the user. But yeah, the more like you kind of think of it's like the database methods you'll see will live in the will start to live in the actual model, in the actual like player.py file, right? So that question about, hey, can we move this thing to a method? Yeah, maybe, you know, like it might be useful even outside the context. It's like, when do we want to use methods? When we want to reuse our code. And it's probably pretty useful, like in general, to be able to like say like, hey, you know, can I have a method that just like, given an ID, returns the corresponding player, right? Okay, other kind of questions or points of confusion, conceptual questions? Like I said, understanding the request response cycle is super, super valuable. Like, I don't know, maybe we'll quiz you on it soon in terms of like, okay, the user goes to the browser. What happens next? Right? Issues a request. Where does it go? Controller. Looks for the corresponding route, right? Finds it. Cool, right? Because if the user goes to /player/ID, we're looking for the match. Find the match. What happens next? Go to the database, get the instance, return the instance, right? This is the model layer or the data layer, right? Then what happens? Send back the response, whether it's JSON or HTML. Okay? This process, like, is going to stay consistent. And like I said, this is not just a Flask thing. This is Ruby on Rails. This is Node. This is whatever, right? This pattern is API development, web development. This is essentially the pattern always used. Okay.
I just have a quick question, like, so the separation between like a model and the controller is not kind of clear cut, right? And
I'd say the model, I mean, eventually we can move this into the like we could move this. People will it's like a sliding scale. I guess you're right. Like with code, there's always, you know, kind of like how much do you want to organize stuff type of feel. And generally what I say is like, you know, so we could call player.find instead of calling this method. And this method I'd say is like more abstract, meaning we're not directly calling we're not directly having the SQL here. And so it's a little harder to figure out what's going on here. And you see player.find, you have to take it a little bit on a leap of faith or look at the code to see what's going on. So this is more abstract than this. And when it's more abstract, it's like more reusable generally. Sometimes it's more flexible. That's like, you know, it's good. So it's more abstract. It's good because it's more reusable. It's more flexible. More flexible. The downside is it's also like more indirect, meaning instead of directly seeing what's occurring here, select all from players where ID equals this, it's indirect. We have to go to this method now to see what's occurring, right? Sometimes that's, you know, so you just kind of consider when this trade-off is worth it, right? Things like that.
Oh, and also like to implement the model in model view controller, do we necessarily using the class like class object or like or other like any other way like still can consider as model view controller?
Say that again about the class.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, so for the model, like it's like a layer between like a database and a controller, right? So the model to implement the model, like do we necessarily using like class, like instantiate a class or like any other like way?
No,
Like
I think you normally will instantiate a class. I actually haven't seen it other
okay,
way. I mean, you could maybe there's like some if it's not a class, it's something very very similar to it. Like maybe there's like some sort of data object. But
okay.
yeah, normally it would be like that. Yeah. Like these things can all there's you it's like the general phrase you'll hear is like separation of concerns. Uh uh right? And I guess one thing you'll see is like there's tons of design patterns. Like there's lots of variations on this on design patterns. This is the one we're like starting with, but like yeah, like you can build, there are whole book there are like not there are like bookshelves of various design patterns. So the idea is like you'll start to get a feel for it, but this trade-off is really valuable to think about. Like when do I kind of introduce something like this? Okay, well, this doesn't really belong here. It belongs in my model, right? Because the model is about the database. And then eventually your model might become too big and you'll kind of find a way to simplify that. Generally, like, if you kind of, oh, no, another thing I want to say is like, if you stick to, like, we didn't really give you too many design patterns when we did tic tac toe. The whole idea was like, methods are 5 lines or shorter. And now that we have classes, it's like classes are 100 lines or fewer. If you stick to this, like you'll naturally write code the right way. So this thing here, let's count how many lines. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're like right at the edge, right? And that's kind of when this thing starts to become more complex, then you want to think of ways to abstract it, right? To like make it simpler again. Like maybe we can put this into a method, these 2 lines, like build connection, right? Like, William recommended, maybe this belongs in my model layer, right? And then eventually your model might become too complex, have over 100 lines of code, and you have to start thinking about changing that around too, right? So that's what I would encourage, like that kind of flexibleness and kind of like what goes together. That's really like so much of coding, and that's so much of coding. So yeah, it's the same way of like organizing a bookshelf or organizing like apps on your iPhone. Like what folder do they belong into? It's the same thing here. Like okay, let's make this simpler. What goes together? All right. Hopefully, I would say like try like explaining with your partner like the whole model view controller concept. Like I said, there's plenty to read about it, or just draw it out. Like just try drawing it out. I'm happy to take a screenshot of this, how as pretty as it is, and then we can, if you want to then draw it out on your own, and really just try to understand it and like try to understand the use case for it, or like okay, controllers really, the whole idea is to try to keep your application simple. Have each kind of file deal with one separate thing. Model is dealing with the database. Controller is dealing with like requests and responses from the browser. Right? Yeah. Okay. Okay.